The HOA tried to bulldoze my family's legacy, so I took down their corrupt president in front of the whole neighborhood. They wanted my land for a clubhouse expansion and buried me in fake fines when I said no. So I showed up to the HOA meeting with photos, receipts, and proof the president's husband was secretly set to profit. The judge wiped the fines, exposed their corruption, and ordered a full investigation. Now she's gone, the board is crumbling, and I'm still on the porch my grandfather built, unbothered and undefeated. I've always believed that a house isn't just walls and a roof. It's where memories live, where stories start and never really end. For me, that place has always been the little brick house on Sycamore Lane. My grandparents bought it back in the 1950s, raised a family in it, and passed it down to my folks, who eventually passed it down to me. The house has seen generations of Hills laughing on the porch, crying in the kitchen, and celebrating just about everything in between. After I retired from the Army, I didn't have to think twice about where I'd settle down. There was no question, this house was home. The front porch still creaked in the same spots it had when I was a kid. The garden still bloomed wild every spring like it had a mind of its own, and every nook in that house whispered a piece of my family's history. I was ready to enjoy the quiet years I had left, tending the yard, sipping coffee as the sun came up, and just being part of a neighborhood I'd known my whole life. It was one of those crisp autumn mornings, the kind where the air feels sharp and clean, and everything smells faintly like leaves and chimney smoke, when the first sign of trouble came through my front door. I was sitting on the porch with a hot cup of coffee in my hand, watching a squirrel terrorize my bird feeder, when I heard the soft thump of something sliding through the mail slot. At first, I figured it was just one of those grocery store flyers, the kind that promise deals on things you don't need. But something about the stiff manila envelope caught my eye. There was a formal-looking seal in the corner, and my gut told me this wasn't a coupon for canned beans. I opened it and unfolded a neatly typed letter on official-looking letterhead from the Sycamore Ridge Homeowners Association. It was signed by Karen Sherman, the HOA president, a name I knew well, though not fondly. Karen had a reputation in the neighborhood, always dressed to the nines, clipboard never far from her grip, and a constant presence at every community event, whether she was wanted there or not. The kind of person who acted like the HOA was the FBI. The letter itself was polite enough on the surface, but there was something beneath the tone that felt off. It was requesting a meeting to discuss the future of the community clubhouse, specifically mentioning my property as a point of interest for potential expansion. There was talk of how my lot sat in a strategic location, and how acquiring it would greatly benefit the neighborhood. I read it twice, then a third time, my coffee growing cold as the uneasiness settled in my chest. This didn't feel like a suggestion. It felt like the opening move in a game I hadn't agreed to play. Something told me that life in my peaceful corner of the world was about to change. 2 days after that letter landed in my hands, Karen showed up at my front door like she was dropping by for a friendly neighborly chat, though the tight-lipped smile and death grip on her clipboard told a different story. It was around 3 in the afternoon, and I was on the porch again, trimming dead leaves off my potted mums, trying not to think about her letter. She walked up the steps like she owned them and gave a quick, polished, "Good afternoon, Mr. Hill," as if we hadn't both lived in this neighborhood for decades. I nodded, trying to keep things civil, and motioned for her to sit on the porch bench. I didn't like her much, but I wasn't raised to be rude. She sat down, legs crossed and clipboard nestled in her lap like a shield. "I hope I'm not interrupting your day," she said in that overly sweet voice that made your skin crawl if you listened too long. "I'm here on behalf of the HOA. I'm sure you received our letter earlier this week." I just gave her a nod, waiting for her to get to the point. "As you know, our community is growing, and we've been working on plans to expand the clubhouse. It's the heart of Sycamore Ridge, and frankly, it's become too small to accommodate all the new activities and residents." She looked around like she expected me to agree, then leaned in slightly. "Your property, Philip, sits right next to the clubhouse. It's the perfect location for this expansion. We're proposing to purchase your home, and of course, we're prepared to offer generous compensation." I stared at her for a moment, taking in every word and every smug detail of her expression. She wasn't asking. She was presenting it like a done deal. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms, letting silence hang in the air for a beat before answering. "I'm not selling," I said, voice steady. "This house belonged to my grandparents. My parents raised me here. I retired here because this place is home. It's not just a plot of land to me, and no amount of money is going to change that." Her smile faltered just a second, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Then she recovered with that same plastic charm. though something behind her eyes had hardened. "Of course, I understand sentimental value," she said, though it didn't sound like she meant it. "But this project is about the greater good of the neighborhood. You'd be helping everyone. Plus, the offer really is quite generous. You could easily find something newer, easier to maintain." "I'm not interested," I said flatly. "This is my home, and I'm staying." That's when the shift happened. Her face didn't change much, but the air around her seemed colder, her tone a little more clipped. "Well," she said, standing up and brushing off her skirt like she'd sat on something unpleasant, "I urge you to at least review the documents we've prepared. The HOA board is meeting next week to finalize details. I hope you'll keep an open mind." She handed me a thick folder packed with neatly stapled pages and vague legal jargon. I didn't even glance at it as she walked away. I knew where I stood. I wasn't going to be bullied into selling off a piece of my life so someone could put up another party room and call it progress. But as I closed the door behind her, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. At first, I tried to go back to my normal routine. Morning coffee on the porch, a walk with Max, my golden retriever, and a little gardening before settling in with a book or the ball game. But ever since Karen's visit, the air felt different. Like the neighborhood wasn't breathing quite right. A few days after our conversation, I found a bright orange notice stuck to my mailbox. The HOA claimed my grass had exceeded the acceptable height limit and slapped me with a $75 fine. That was laughable. I'd mowed it just 2 days prior, and it looked like a putting green. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe it was a clerical mistake or a one-off nitpick. But it didn't stop there. By the end of the week, I'd received 3 more notices. One accused me of having an improperly installed mailbox. Another cited me for porch lights that were apparently too bright. The last one fined me for unauthorized garden decor, which I guessed meant the wind chimes my mother gave me before she passed. Each notice came with its own fine, and the total was adding up fast. At that point, it was obvious. This wasn't about lawn maintenance or community standards. Karen was using her position to make my life miserable. Every violation was vague, every fine just aggressive enough to rattle the cage without drawing too much attention. I started documenting everything. Photos of my lawn with a ruler in the grass, time-stamped and dated. Receipts from the hardware store for the new mailbox I didn't even need. Even the packaging from the light bulbs, which were well within brightness guidelines. I was careful, methodical. Years in the military had taught me that much. Meanwhile, things in the neighborhood were starting to shift. My morning walks used to be full of nods, smiles, little chats about the weather or the latest college football scores. But now, people crossed the street when they saw me coming. Conversations stopped the second I was within earshot. A few neighbors still waved, but it was tight-lipped and awkward, like they were worried Karen might be watching. I even spotted her one afternoon near the clubhouse, surrounded by a cluster of residents. She was talking animatedly, gesturing in my direction with that same clipboard tucked under her arm. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew exactly what story she was spinning. That I was the reason the community couldn't move forward. That I was selfish, unreasonable, holding everyone back. And the worst part? Some of them were starting to believe it. The distance between me and the neighborhood I'd always loved was growing wider by the day. Karen wasn't just sending letters now. She was building a wall around me, one petty violation and whispered rumor at a time. By the time the 5th violation notice showed up, this one claiming the garden hose on my side yard was unsightly and improperly stored. I realized this wasn't going to slow down anytime soon. Karen had declared war, and I was apparently her battlefield. I kept calm, but I didn't let anything slide. I took photos of that garden hose, coiled neatly on its reel next to the spigot, looking like something out of a hardware store catalog. I had documentation for everything now: grass height, mailbox specs, light fixtures, even the type of solar path lights I'd bought, all within the so-called guidelines. I organized everything into folders, both digital and paper. If Karen wanted to play this game, I was going to be ready. That same evening, while I was sorting through receipts at the kitchen table, my phone buzzed. It was Angela, a longtime neighbor who lived 3 houses down. She and I had always been on good terms, shared cookies during holidays, watched each other's houses when one of us traveled, that kind of friendship. Her text was short but telling. "Karen's telling people you're blocking progress. She's saying you're hurting the community. Be careful, she's got the board in her pocket." I sat back, staring at the message, feeling the pressure mount. Karen wasn't just hitting me with bogus fines, she was poisoning the well, trying to turn everyone around me into enemies. If I let her keep painting that picture, it wouldn't be long before I was completely isolated, just the grumpy old man clinging to the past. So I decided it was time to push back. I sat down and drafted a formal letter to the HOA. Not just some angry rant. I laid it out clean and professional. I disputed every single violation, attached photographic evidence, quoted sections from the HOA bylaws, and explained exactly how I was in compliance with each supposed rule I'd allegedly broken. At the end of the letter, I made it crystal clear. I was not selling my property, and I was requesting that all future communications regarding a potential sale cease immediately. I printed it, signed it, made a copy for my own records, and walked it down to Karen's mailbox myself. I stood there for a second after sliding it in, wondering if it would make any difference, but at least now it was official. I wasn't just ignoring her. I was standing my ground, with proof, with facts, and with the quiet strength that had gotten me through far worse than an overzealous HOA president. As I walked back to my house under the setting sun, I felt a small spark of something that had been missing since that first letter arrived. Resolve. Karen had underestimated me. I might be old school, but I wasn't easy to push around. It didn't take long after I dropped that letter in Karen's mailbox for things to escalate. I'd expected more pushback, sure, but I didn't think she'd double down so fast or so dirty. Within days, new violation notices began arriving like clockwork. This time they weren't even pretending to make sense. One accused me of leaving unsecured debris in my yard. Another claimed my dog Max was excessively vocal, which was ridiculous. He barked maybe twice a day, and only at squirrels that dared cross the fence line. I knew what this was. It was punishment. Karen was using the HOA rules as a weapon, and now that I'd formally stood up to her, she was swinging harder. The fines were small individually, but they added up fast. And they weren't really about the money. They were about exhausting me, making me feel overwhelmed, alone, and maybe, just maybe, willing to give in and sell. But I didn't flinch. I kept documenting everything, every notice, every response. I had my camera ready anytime I stepped outside. Still, the pressure wasn't just on paper, it was spreading through the neighborhood like smoke from a slow-burning fire. One afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find a group of neighbors gathered on the sidewalk across the street, right in front of my house. Karen stood in the middle, clipboard in hand, speaking with her usual dramatic flair. As I stepped out of my truck, the group went quiet and started drifting away, but not before I caught the end of one of her sentences. "We can't let one person stall progress for the whole community." She said it loud enough that I knew it was meant for me. I didn't say a word, just carried my groceries inside, but the knot in my stomach tightened. That night, Angela texted me again. "She's telling the board you're refusing to cooperate. She's pushing for formal action. Be careful." Then came the next low blow. Early one morning, just after sunrise, I was pouring a cup of coffee when I heard a truck outside. I looked out the window and saw two guys in neon vests unloading equipment onto my front lawn. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. "What the hell is this?" I asked. One of the workers glanced up from his clipboard and said, "We're here on behalf of the HOA. Got orders to trim the lawn and remove unauthorized garden items." I looked at my yard, which I'd mowed and edged 2 days prior, and at the ceramic gnome and bird bath I'd had for years without a single complaint. "Everything here is compliant," I said, jaw tight. "I didn't authorize this." The guy just shrugged. "You'll have to take it up with the HOA, sir. We're just following orders." I didn't argue further. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording as they marched across my yard, pulling up my solar lights and knocking over the bird bath. By the time they were done, my yard looked like it had been raided. My garden decor, still within guidelines, lay broken near the sidewalk. Later that evening, Angela stopped by with a batch of cookies and a grim look on her face. "I heard what happened," she said. "Karen's telling people you left them no choice. That you refused to keep your property up to standard, so the HOA had to step in." I shook my head, biting back the anger. "She's abusing her position, and no one's stopping her." "You're not wrong," Angela said, lowering her voice. "But people are scared. She's got influence, and no one wants to be her next target." I knew then this wasn't just about me. Karen had the neighborhood under her thumb, and if she thought she could shame me into giving up, she was going to learn real fast that I wasn't built for quitting. After watching my yard get trampled by HOA workers like it was some sort of battleground and hearing that Karen was out there spinning her version of events, I knew it was time to stop playing defense. I'd had enough. If she wanted to drag this into the public arena, then that's exactly where I was going to meet her. I started attending the HOA meetings, not to sit quietly in the back, but to make my voice heard. The next one was held in the clubhouse, the very building they wanted to expand onto my property. I showed up early, dressed in my Sunday best, not to impress, but to send a message. I wasn't going anywhere. When the meeting started, Karen took her usual seat at the head of the long folding table, flanked by her loyal board members. She greeted the room with that artificial smile she wore like a mask, then dove into her agenda. When the topic of community development came up, she started laying it on thick, talking about growth and progress and how certain residents were resisting change. That was my cue. I stood up, cleared my throat, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I've got something to say." A few people turned to look. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept that same tight smile. "Of course, Mr. Hill. You have the floor." I stepped forward and placed a thick folder on the table in front of her. "Inside this," I said, "you'll find copies of every violation notice sent to me over the past month. You'll also find timestamped photos showing my lawn within regulation height, receipts for my new mailbox, light bulb packaging confirming they meet HOA standards, and a video of your workers trespassing on my property without permission." The room went silent. Karen tried to interrupt, but I kept going. "This isn't enforcement. This is harassment. I have complied with every single HOA regulation, and I have the evidence to prove it. The truth is, ever since I declined to sell my home, Karen's been using her position to target me and make my life hell." I passed out copies of the documents to every board member and a few curious neighbors. As they flipped through the pages, the mood in the room shifted. That fake smile on Karen's face started to falter. "Mr. Hill," she said, trying to recover, "we understand your concerns, but the HOA's actions have always been in the best interest of the community. If you believe you've been treated unfairly, you're welcome to file an appeal through the proper channels." I met her eyes. "And appeal to who? This same board that's been backing every one of your bogus violations?" "I don't think so. But don't worry, I'm taking this further. I've already contacted a property rights attorney." That got everyone's attention. The quiet rustle of papers gave way to whispers. People were shifting in their seats now, unsure who to believe, but clearly starting to see through the act. Karen didn't respond. She just sat there, hands folded, lips pressed thin. The meeting ended in chaos, some neighbors defending her, others looking confused, a few walking up to me afterward to quietly thank me for speaking out. The neighborhood tension had cracked wide open. The line had been drawn. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: I'd finally pushed back hard enough to shake the ground she stood on. The morning after that explosive HOA meeting, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. If Karen wanted to play power games, then I was done trying to reason with her. I needed backup, someone who knew the law and could help me put a stop to this once and for all. That same afternoon, I reached out to Thomas Grayson, a well-respected property rights attorney I'd been referred to by an old Army buddy. Thomas wasn't flashy or full of legal jargon. He was sharp, steady, and straight to the point, the kind of guy who could stare down a mountain of HOA nonsense and not blink. We met the next day at his office, a quiet place tucked between a bakery and a tax prep center downtown. I brought every folder I had: violation notices, photos, videos, receipts, HOA bylaws, even a copy of the original letter Karen had sent me about buying my home. Thomas flipped through it all, nodding occasionally, eyes narrowing whenever he saw something especially ridiculous. After a while, he sat back and said, "You've got a strong case, Philip. This isn't just petty enforcement, it's targeted harassment. And if the HOA is threatening to place a lien on your property based on these bogus fines, that's a serious abuse of power." Hearing that out loud sent a wave of relief through me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. I was being bullied, and now I had someone in my corner. Thomas got to work immediately. Together, we drafted a formal complaint addressed not only to the HOA but to the state regulatory board that oversees homeowners associations. We documented everything with precision, laying out a timeline that showed exactly how Karen's campaign started after I refused to sell. But the real breakthrough came a few days later when Thomas called me, his voice unusually excited. "We found something," he said. "Karen's husband owns a construction company. Guess who's been quietly lined up to handle the clubhouse expansion if your property goes through?" My stomach dropped. "You're kidding." "Not at all. Emails, meeting minutes, and contract drafts, all of it pointing to her pushing this project while hiding her personal financial interest. It's a textbook conflict of interest, and it violates HOA bylaws, not to mention state ethics codes." That was the smoking gun. Karen hadn't just been overstepping, she'd been engineering a deal that would profit her family under the guise of community improvement. With that evidence in hand, the fight officially shifted gears. Thomas filed a counterclaim, citing harassment, abuse of authority, and a clear conflict of interest. The complaint demanded the HOA cease all attempts to collect fines, drop the lien threats, and investigate Karen's conduct. We weren't just defending my home anymore. We were challenging the rotten foundation beneath the entire operation. As news of the legal action started to circulate, I noticed the energy in the neighborhood change. People weren't whispering about me as much. Some even started nodding again during walks. Karen, on the other hand, had gone quiet. No more sidewalk gatherings, no more flyers or loud announcements near the clubhouse. She knew the tide was turning. I had a lawyer. I had evidence. And now, I had momentum. The morning of the hearing, I sat on my porch with a thermos of coffee in my hands, watching the sun rise over the neighborhood I had fought so hard to protect. The air felt heavier than usual, not with fear, but with anticipation. Today wasn't just another battle, it was the reckoning. Thomas Grayson pulled into my driveway right on time, dressed in a sharp gray suit and carrying a briefcase that held months of our preparation. As I slid into the passenger seat, he looked over and said calmly, "This is just the beginning, Philip. But today we lay it all out." The courthouse was modest, nothing like the sprawling courthouses you see on TV, just a brick building with squeaky floors and wooden benches. Karen arrived shortly after us, flanked by the HOA's attorney, a slick-looking man in a dark suit who looked like he'd rehearsed every word in front of a mirror. She didn't make eye contact with me as we waited, her usual smug expression replaced with something tighter, more controlled, like a mask that was starting to crack. A few neighbors had shown up, scattered throughout the room, curious about how far this mess had come. When the judge entered and we all rose, I felt my nerves settle. This wasn't about charm or politics or HOA gossip. It was about facts, and we had plenty. Thomas opened with a clear, steady voice, walking the court through a detailed timeline. He presented every violation notice, each one followed by photographic proof of compliance. He submitted receipts, videos, even the correspondence between me and the HOA. He made it impossible to ignore the pattern. Everything started after I refused to sell my home. Then came the turning point. Thomas revealed the emails, meeting notes, and HOA documents that showed Karen had pushed for the clubhouse expansion while hiding the fact that her husband's construction company stood to land the contract. The courtroom fell silent. You could feel the shift, like a curtain had been pulled back, and no one could pretend anymore. When it was their turn, the HOA's lawyer did his best to downplay the whole situation, claiming the violations were issued in good faith, and the expansion project was a community necessity. Karen sat still, lips pursed, whispering occasionally to her lawyer, but never speaking aloud. The judge listened to everything without interruption, taking notes and nodding slowly, her face unreadable. After a short recess, we returned to hear the ruling. The judge looked directly at Karen as she spoke. "It is evident," she began, "that the Homeowners Association, under Ms. Sherman's leadership, engaged in a pattern of targeted behavior toward Mr. Hill following his refusal to sell his property. The violations were retaliatory in nature, and the threats of legal action were an abuse of authority." She paused, then turned her gaze toward me. "All fines issued against Mr. Hill are hereby nullified. The Homeowners Association is ordered to cease any further actions intended to penalize him for issues already proven compliant." I felt my shoulders drop, a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying lifting in an instant. But she wasn't finished. Furthermore, the judge continued, eyes back on Karen, "This court finds that Ms. Sherman failed to disclose a significant conflict of interest involving the proposed clubhouse expansion. This matter will be referred to the appropriate oversight authorities for further investigation." Karen's face went pale. For the first time since this all began, her confidence cracked wide open. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but closed it just as quickly, realizing the damage had been done. Outside the courthouse, a few neighbors approached me with quiet congratulations, some embarrassed, some surprised, others offering sincere apologies for not stepping in sooner. Angela was among them, a proud smile on her face. "You did it, Philip," she said. "You stood up to her, and you won." I nodded, not out of pride, but out of deep relief. The war was over, at least on paper. But I knew healing the neighborhood would be its own kind of battle. Still, I had my home, my peace, and the truth on record. That, more than anything, made the fight worth it. The days that followed the court ruling felt strange, quiet, but not in the comforting way I was used to. It was more like the calm that settles in after a tornado has passed through, where everything still stands but nothing feels exactly the same. Word about the judge's decision spread fast, and it didn't take long for Karen Sherman's carefully crafted image to start crumbling. A week after the hearing, she officially resigned from her position as HOA president. She tried to frame it as a personal decision, said she wanted to focus more on family, but nobody was buying it. The conflict of interest, the harassment, the lies, it was all out in the open now. Her grip on the neighborhood had finally snapped. With her gone, the rest of the board scrambled to save face. A few members stepped down voluntarily, and a special election was held to fill the empty seats. For the first time in years, people in the neighborhood actually seemed interested in who was running and what they stood for. A handful of new voices, folks who genuinely cared about the community, stepped up and promised to make changes. Transparency, fairness, oversight. I didn't go around campaigning or throwing my name in the ring. I just watched it unfold quietly from my porch, content to finally breathe again. Within a few weeks, the new board began rolling out real changes. They launched a full review of every violation issued during Karen's tenure, tossed out the baseless ones, and created an independent committee to handle future disputes. People finally had a way to speak up without fearing retaliation. The clubhouse expansion was shelved indefinitely, and you could almost feel the tension start to lift from the sidewalks and front lawns. Still, I didn't jump right back into neighborhood life. I kept my head down, tending to my garden, walking Max, fixing up little things around the house that had been neglected while I was neck-deep in legal documents. But slowly, little by little, the walls started to come down. One afternoon, I was out front pulling weeds when a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in months came by with a six-pack and a sheepish grin. "Hey, man," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. What Karen did to you was wrong." We cracked open a couple of beers right there on the porch and talked for a good hour. After that, more neighbors started to drop by. Some offered quiet thanks. Others shared their own stories about how they'd been pushed around by the old board. Angela, as always, stayed close, showing up with fresh vegetables from her garden, little updates on neighborhood gossip, and a sense of warmth I hadn't realized I missed. There was no grand parade or official apology, but the shift was real. The people who had once averted their eyes now stopped to chat. The clubhouse that once felt like enemy ground started hosting actual community events, potlucks, game nights, meet and greets. Folks who used to stay behind closed doors now brought lawn chairs out on warm evenings, waving at anyone who passed. I wasn't trying to be a hero or a leader. I just wanted my home back. But somewhere along the way, the fight I took on for myself ended up making the whole place better. The storm had passed. The wreckage was being cleared. And slowly, this little corner of the world that had once felt like a battlefield was beginning to feel like a neighborhood again. It's funny how peace doesn't always come with fanfare or fireworks. Sometimes, it just slips in quietly and sits beside you like an old friend. That's how it felt in the weeks after everything settled. The HO had been restructured, Karen was gone, and the ridiculous fines were wiped clean from the books. I could finally sit on my porch in the mornings, coffee in hand, without wondering what fresh nonsense might show up in my mailbox. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood like a thundercloud had started to lift, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Life eased back into its natural rhythm. I spent more time in the garden, pruning the roses and pulling weeds, just like I always had. Max took longer walks with me, wagging his tail like he knew we'd won something important. And neighbors, real neighbors, started stopping by again. Some apologized for staying silent during the worst of it, and others just wanted to reconnect. Either way, I welcomed it. I didn't hold grudges. I just wanted to live in peace. Angela remained a steady presence, checking in with a basket of cookies one week, fresh vegetables the next. One afternoon, she sat with me on the porch as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops. "You know," she said, "this neighborhood feels different now. Better. And a lot of that is because of you." I gave a little laugh, shaking my head. I didn't do it for anyone else. I just wanted to protect my home. "Maybe," she said, smiling. "But sometimes one person standing their ground reminds everyone else what matters." That stuck with me. I hadn't set out to lead any crusade. I just didn't want to be bullied out of the place that held my family's history. But in the process, I saw something bigger, how easy it is for people to get pushed around when no one speaks up, and how powerful one voice can be when it refuses to back down. This house, this neighborhood, it's more than buildings and sidewalks. It's a community. And while it may not always get everything right, it's worth fighting for when it goes wrong. I still keep all the paperwork from the case neatly filed away in a box in the hall closet, just in case. Old habits die hard. But most days, that box stays shut, and I focus on the present. The garden, the porch, the peace I fought to reclaim. The storm didn't break me, it shaped me. And when I look at my home now, I don't just see bricks and wood. I see strength, legacy, and the quiet kind of justice that comes from standing your ground when it matters most.